It's just 1 o'clock now. We'll wait a few minutes.
Yeah. Oh, you're waiting 2 minutes.
Expecting anybody else? Either here for coming to today's rounds, UHN, ClinEpi, and Health Services Research Rounds. Today's speaker is Maria Cusimano. She's going to talk about practice patterns and long-term health outcomes of bilateral oophorectomy and benign hysterectomy. And I need to remind you that this is a PhD transfer defense. So Maria is going to give a 20-minute presentation during which you shouldn't interrupt, after which there'll be rounds of questions from everyone here. When the open session of questions is finished, then everyone who isn't faculty will be asked to leave, and then their faculty will remain and discuss the presentation and make a decision about whether Maria progresses to the PhD program. Okay, that's all correct, and that's all I need to say. So I'm going to sit down and let you take over.
Thank you.
Is someone going to be timing her, or should I do that?
Sure.
You can do it.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you especially to the IHPME faculty who are here. So this is, as George said, going to be a proposal for a PhD project. Oh gosh, not for that sheet. Or not, is it?
Sometimes it isn't switched on. It's switched on.
Is there a keyboard?
I don't know. Oh.
Yeah, it's working now.
It's working now?
Yeah.
Okay, try that.
I think it may have been on the wrong input.
There we go. Perfect. Great. Thank you. Okay. All right. So hysterectomy, removal of the uterus, is the most common major surgery performed in non-pregnant women worldwide. To put that into context, in Ontario, there are about 35,000 hysterectomies done every year. And a critical decision at the time of hysterectomy is whether to also perform a bilateral oophorectomy or removal of both ovaries. Traditionally, that's been offered at the time of a benign hysterectomy in order to prevent ovarian cancer, which is a deadly malignancy not detected early by the screening test that we have available. That said, the ovaries are major endocrine organs, so removing them, especially in premenopausal women, results in an abrupt drop in estrogen levels and the complete cessation of ovarian hormone production. So that may be detrimental to long-term health, because we know estrogen is involved in a number of normal physiologic processes throughout the body, in the cardiovascular system, the brain, the bones, and other sites as well. A number of previous observational studies have tried to look at this and have compared outcomes between women who have and have not had an oophorectomy at the time of hysterectomy. I've included the 4 major studies in the field here. The WHI and NHS studies were prospective longitudinal cohort studies, and the MOA1 and HES studies were retrospective population-based cohort studies, the former in Olmsted County, Minnesota, and the latter in England. These studies were consistent in showing no association between DSO and adverse health outcomes in women over the age of 50 at the time of their surgery, so over around the average age of menopause. But there was quite a lot of variation in the associations observed for women under the age of 50. The most consistent findings were for increased all-cause mortality and increased ischemic heart disease in women who were having BSO under the age of 50, but even here the hazard ratios ranged quite significantly from close to 1 to 2. In addition to the variation with these studies, they were also subject to some methodologic limitations. For the prospective studies in particular, these studies enrolled women years to even decades after their original oophorectomy. So this could introduce a selection bias in that women who had an oophorectomy and subsequently died or experienced a debilitating event would not be able to be recruited into those studies. They are also subject to information bias, confounding bias, inadequate follow-up. The HES study, which is the largest to date, had a mean follow-up of only 6 years. And many of these were also underpowered to actually stratify by those age groups. Some of the uncertainty around these studies is reflected in current guidelines. So these are American and Canadian guidelines on the topic. While all are pretty consistent in recommending against routine DSO for premenopausal women, they don't provide any detail on what the risks are, how women should be counseled, and what should be done for perimenopausal or postmenopausal women. So I want to highlight that we need additional well-designed observational studies with larger sample sizes and longer follow-up to more reliably quantify health effects following BSO. And we need data on current practice patterns with respect to this procedure in a Canadian setting, specifically in Ontario as well. We don't have that information right now, and if BSO is associated with adverse outcomes, having this information would help us identify targets for knowledge translation. So our goal is for this to be a 3-paper thesis with each objective corresponding to 1 paper. So objective 1 is to describe temporal trends in BSO at benign hysterectomy in Ontario from 1998 to 2017, and to explore how the prevalence of BSO at benign hysterectomy varies based on patient and surgeon factors. Objective 2 is to determine if BSO compared to ovarian conservation is associated with cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, osteoporosis, and cancers. And objective 3 is to determine if BSO compared to ovarian conservation is associated with all-cause, cause-specific, and premature mortality. So to address these objectives, we'll perform several population-based observational studies using linked administrative databases held at ICES. These will allow us to ascertain our exposures, outcomes, and key covariates. A number of population databases will be used for patient demographic and mortality information. Numerous health services databases will provide information on patient diagnostic and procedural information, and several ICES-derived cohorts and registries provide information on the diseases of interest for this study. So for objective 1, looking at temporal trends and factors associated with BSO, we will perform a population-based cross-sectional study. We'll include adult women over the age of 18 who have undergone an elective hysterectomy between January 1998 and December 2017. We will exclude women who are undergoing hysterectomy for a peripartum indication, for a malignant indication, or if they have a known genetic susceptibility to malignancy, if they're having surgery for an emergent indication, or if they've had a previous bilateral oophorectomy. To identify hysterectomy, which is the main inclusion into our cohort, and to identify BSO, which is our main outcome for this cross-sectional study, we will use Canadian Classification of Surgical Procedure Codes, or CCP codes prior to 2002, and Canadian Classification of Health Intervention Codes, CCI codes, after 2002. The CCI codes specifically have been validated against primary chart abstraction and have high agreement, sensitivity, and positive predictive value. For this cross-sectional study, we will be considering patients clustered within surgeons. So the covariates of interest for this study will be characteristics of the patients themselves and the surgeons who are performing their operation. So all of the covariates that we have selected were chosen a priori based on relationships with BSO as reported in the literature and also on their availability in ICES data. So these are some of the patient level covariates we will be looking at. I've included how we are operationalizing them and the data source from which we will obtain them, but just briefly for now, I'm happy to come back to this slide afterwards, but briefly we'll be looking at age at surgery, year of surgery, indication for surgery, surgical approach, number of previous live births, area of residence, marginalization, which is an area level socioeconomic index derived from Canadian census data, immigration status comorbidities, which will be ascertained using aggregated diagnosis groups of the Johns Hopkins ACG system, prior malignancy, and prior ovarian surgery. At the surgeon level, we will look at surgeon sex, specialty, country of graduation, years since graduation, that will be defined at the time of the index surgery, and hysterectomy volume, again defined at the time of the index surgery, and we'll be looking at the total number of hysterectomies performed in the 1 year prior to the surgical procedure. In terms of our analytic plan for this objective, we will start just simply with a description of our cohort. So we'll use descriptive statistics to compare characteristics of those who did and did not undergo BSO at the time of benign hysterectomy. To assess temporal trends, we will perform both an adjusted and unadjusted and adjusted analysis. So our unadjusted analysis will be to plot yearly proportions of hysterectomy with BSO from 1998 to 2017 and to test for linear trends using the Cochrane-Armitage test. We'll do this overall and also stratified for key patient characteristics of interest to us, which is age group at the time of surgery and indication for surgery. For our adjusted stratified analysis, we will use a multivariable logistic regression model with the dependent variable as our BSO status and our independent variable several key patient characteristics. This will allow us to output adjusted yearly proportions, and we'll again plot these and compare them to our unadjusted analysis. And then to identify patients and surgeon factors associated with BSO, we will generate a multivariable logistic regression model using a GEE approach. Again, this will have BSO status as our dependent variable, and all the patient and surgeon level factors we've identified a priori as our independent variables. We selected a GEE approach to be able to account for clustering of patients with different surgeons, but also to obtain population average odds ratios, which is really what was of interest to us. That would allow us to assess the magnitude of the association between these factors and our outcome of interest. So for objectives 2 and 3, looking at long-term health outcomes and mortality after BSO, we're going to be doing a population-based retrospective cohort study. I'm going to describe some features of this together because it overlaps a little on both objectives, but then I'll move into the analytic plan for each specifically. So our study population here will be adults, will be basically very similar to objective 1. The only difference is I'm adding a few additional covariate exclusion criteria, excuse me. So we will exclude women in this cohort who have had any previous type of ovarian surgery prior to their index hysterectomy, and also women who have had any outcome of interest at baseline. So that would include any previous malignancy and any prevalent cardiovascular, neurodegenerative, or osteoporotic disease at the time of their initial hysterectomy. This is just an overview of the study timeline. So we will accrue patients between January 1996 and December 2015. The index date will be the date of hysterectomy. We'll look back from then to as early as 1964 to establish our exclusion criteria and covariates, and look forward from that point for an event up to a maximum follow-up of December 2018 for all-cause mortality and disease incidence, and then to December 2017 for cause-specific mortality. The only difference there being the database that includes cause of death information lags a little bit behind the others. So our main exposure will be bilateral oophorectomy, and the comparator will be ovarian conservation, which could mean no oophorectomy, meaning conservation of both ovaries, or a unilateral oophorectomy retaining one ovary. We chose this comparison because it's really most clinically relevant for what a gynecologist may actually do during surgery, and it reflects retaining some estrogen production by the ovaries versus complete absence of estrogen production. So these are our covariates. I won't repeat this. It is the same to what I mentioned for objective 1. The only difference here is that we won't be including surgeon factors in these models. We did not feel that those would be associated with our outcomes of interest. We will be including some additional patient-level covariates on additional comorbidities, specifically diabetes and hypertension, which we know to be associated with many of our outcomes of interest, and we will obtain those from ISIS-derived cohorts. So again, I'm just going to speak generally about our overall analytic approach and then move into each specifically. So for all of our analyses, we've decided to stratify by age group at the time of surgery. The reason we've decided on this is twofold. First of all, we already anticipate, based on previous literature, that there will be differences in the effect of BSO based on the age at which surgery is performed. And secondly, we anticipate a large sample size that would allow us to do this. So we will stratify our analysis into 3 age groups. First, a premenopausal age group under the age of 45, a perimenopausal age group aged 45 to 55, and a postmenopausal age group over the age of 55. We will then plan to generate separate time-to-event models for each outcome within these strata. We will use a competing risks approach if our outcome could be precluded by other events. These will all be marginal models to account for the clustering of patients within surgeons. And the main exposure and covariates that I've described in the last few slides will be consistent across these models. 2 other points to note. First, with respect to operationalizing our main exposure, it is possible that women who have their ovaries conserved at their initial hysterectomy could subsequently have ovarian surgery and so transition from having conservation to having their ovaries removed. We know from the literature that this is very unlikely, about 5% at 20 years follow-up. So for this reason, in our primary analysis, we plan to treat BSO status as a static exposure, but we will perform several sensitivity analyses to ensure that our findings are robust, one in which we exclude patients who've had subsequent surgery, and another in which we consider BSO status as a time-varying exposure. Then with respect to operationalizing one of our key covariates, which is age at surgery, even within age strata, we anticipate that the effect of BSO may may vary based on the age at which surgery is performed. So to account for that, we plan to operationalize age at surgery as a categorical variable in our perimenopausal age group into 2-year groups, and in our premenopausal and postmenopausal age groups into 5-year groups, and then test for significant interactions between BSO status and age at surgery in order to see if, and if so, how significantly the effect of BSO status changes based on the age at which surgery is performed. Okay, so moving into objective 2 a little bit more specifically now. Again, this is looking at disease incident outcomes. So we will obtain these using validated algorithms for administrative health data. I've included the validation studies as well as the sensitivity and specificity for these algorithms here on the slide. So cardiovascular disease will be assessed as a composite of ischemic heart disease, congestive heart failure, and stroke or transient ischemic attack. Neurodegenerative disease with a composite of Alzheimer's and related dementias and Parkinsonism, and osteoporotic disease as a composite of osteoporosis and osteoporosis-related fractures. Cancers, including any cancer or specific cancers, which for us are namely ovarian cancer, breast cancer, colon, and lung cancer, will be ascertained from the Ontario Cancer Registry, which we know to be over 95% complete. So the analyses for these disease incident outcomes will account for death as a competing event that could preclude any of these diseases from developing. So in terms of our unadjusted analysis, we will plot cumulative incidence functions for these outcomes and compare across BSO status using the gray test. For adjusted analyses, we will generate marginal cause-specific hazards models. Again, these will be stratified by our age group and include the covariates I described. We chose a cause-specific approach because we were really interested in a question of disease etiology and epidemiology. We will include time-varying covariates to account for how the development of one outcome may influence the development of another. I'll just give you an example. If someone develops cardiovascular disease, that could put them at risk for dementia later on. So we will account for that using time-varying covariates. And for these models, we will censor at death, loss to follow-up, which we've defined as 2 consecutive quarters of OHIP ineligibility and end of follow-up. For objective 3, we are looking at mortality outcomes. So specifically all-cause mortality, premature mortality, which is defined as death prior to the age of 75. We've included this because it's this outcome is more amenable to intervention, medical intervention, or population health intervention than all-cause mortality. So we felt that was important to include as an outcome as well. And then cancer-specific mortality and non-cancer-specific mortality. For all-cause and premature mortality, we have no competing risks to consider here. So our unadjusted analyses will be plotting the cumulative incidence of each outcome and comparing across BSO status using the log rank test. And our adjusted analyses we will generate marginal multivariable Cox proportional hazards models, censoring at loss to follow-up, age 75 for premature mortality only, and end of follow-up. For cancer and non-cancer specific mortality, this would again require a competing risks approach, which will be similar to what we took for our disease incidence outcomes. I'm happy to come back here again if any further questions on that. So to demonstrate feasibility of our study, we calculated our power to detect differences for objectives 2 and 3. We took estimates of BSO prevalence and survival after BSO from existing literature. Assuming around 630,000 benign hysterectomies in Ontario over our 20-year accrual period, a minimum follow-up of at least 3 years for all patients in our cohort, and an alpha of 0.05, we would have 80% power to detect any hazard ratios above 1.1 to 1.1 for both cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. So this will be the largest study of its kind, and it will overcome some of the limitations of previous work. We will have power to stratify our analysis by age group, which is of clinical interest. We'll be able to minimize the risk of selection bias with the use of a population-based cohort. The use of validated algorithms for key outcome measures will also distinguish us from previous work, and we will have an estimated mean follow-up of about 13 years, which is double that of the largest study to date. Our cohort study will enable reliable identification of the health effects of BSO, and our descriptive study will have direct implications for care in a Canadian setting in Ontario and help us identify targets for knowledge translation of this work. In terms of limitations, we will have unmeasured confounding, and I've listed a few here, and particularly for this study, we'll have an unmeasured effect modifier, which is hormone replacement therapy after surgery. So that is a limitation of this work. Also, this study essentially treats all these outcomes independently as discrete events, and something that will need to come from this is to sort of tie all this information together in a way that will inform clinical decision making, and that will need to be a focus of future work as well. So in terms of feasibility, I've also completed all my coursework with respect to what would be required for a PhD, and I've obtained grant funding for this project. I've allotted about 3 to 4 months for analysis and writing of each objective, 6 months for writing my thesis and defending. That's it. Thank you very much.
So now we're open for questions. I'll ask a question to get started.
Yeah.
So can you go back to the slide, one of the slides where you showed the sensitivity and specificity and so on for the validated codes?
Yeah.
So we, people do this all the time with ICES studies. They say the codes are validated and then they ignore these numbers. So when I see something like 68% sensitivity and 98.9%, so you got to miss a fair number of strokes, and then that 98.9% specificity applies to all people. If you said it applies to all people who didn't have strokes, that's an awful lot of false positives. Most people don't have a stroke.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you can do about that?
There is. And I have an extra slide on this. Where is it? Where is it? Somewhere in here. Here. So I know there is a SAS algorithm, a SAS macro, that allows us to correct for bias resulting from this classification. So we can actually input these sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive values into into our analysis and sort of correct in a way for the misclassification that would be expected based on these algorithms. So I think the very fact that we have them and we have published estimates is still better than previous work, because we'll be able to account for that uncertainty around information bias and misclassification. So
I think if you do it, it'll be really valuable contribution. I think people maybe should be doing this more.
Yeah.
And a related question that I will stop monopolizing time. You have for the identification of people having women having hysterectomy.
Yeah.
Similar thing, but there it seems like you've got more opportunity to actually validate the codes, because you're not just looking at hysterectomy, yes, no, you're looking at some other characteristics, like the surgeon characteristics and so on. So what would happen if someone's identified by that smaller set of codes having a hysterectomy, but then you don't have any data relating to a hysterectomy? What would you do? Would you treat that as
identified, you mean, with the...
Well, yeah, can you go back?
Yeah, of course,
I'm not familiar with the codes. So
yeah,
my question doesn't make any sense.
Go back,
Right. So, so you have the collection of codes that, for say, in the bilateral oophorectomy.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect.
No.
Sensitive specificity. So a woman gets identified as having had a bilateral oophorectomy. Is there anything else you'd be collecting that could help you determine whether that's actually true or not? Because I know you're collecting other variables related to the surgery, or are they already part of these codes?
Good question. So I guess the surgeon will be identified with the OHIP billing associated with that code. So there's two ways to identify whether the surgery has happened. One is with these high codes, and the other is with the OHIP billing code. So we could compare the two. The only difficulty with the OHIP codes for oophorectomy is it doesn't distinguish between a unilateral or a bilateral. So that's the reason why we're relying predominantly on the CCI codes for here, but it does serve as a comparison.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe to go back to objective one, one of the things you're interested in was looking at the relative contribution of provider versus patient characteristics.
Yeah.
So you spoke about using a GE model. What other approaches are there, and what are the relative merits?
Yeah. So I won't scroll all the way there, but we thought about using a mixed model as well. There were a few considerations that went into it, which ultimately led us to stay with the GE. First of all, in the end, we decided we were really only interested in two levels, which was the patient and the surgeon level. When we really looked at what sort of hospital level covariates that we might be interested in, there was really only one, which was whether a hospital was a teaching hospital or not a teaching hospital. So we thought that if we did want to explore that, we could still stratify our models based on surgery that happened in a teaching hospital and be able to look at the effect of these factors in those two separate groups. And then it came down to what we were really interested in was the population average odds ratios, not the cluster-specific odds ratios that we would get with a mixed model. So that was why, in the end, we thought it was a bit of a more simpler approach, but also really getting at the question that we wanted to ask. So that was why we went with GE.
Just one quick, unrelated follow-up question. So if hormone replacement therapy, has that changed substantially in its risk profile and type over time? And if so, how would that affect your results?
So I don't know if the risk profile over time, but possibly in the use of it over time, and when gynecologists decided to prescribe it versus not, and to what age groups they decided to prescribe it with versus not. So that would certainly change over time. And it's hard to account for because we simply don't have that data. But I think in part clustering our patients within surgeons would hopefully account for some of the variability around that and how some patients' outcomes may be more similar to one another if they've had the same surgeon. But yeah, it's hard to account for that. Yes.
I'm wondering why you chose to cause of death from RPDB instead of OCR, because we know that RPDB doesn't have more, it's less accurate than the OCR source cause of death.
Okay. We had chosen it. I think we have longer follow-up with RPDB. We'll be able to ascertain more events. That was one reason, but we could definitely compare both and see what we have.
I think OCR has updated cause of death to, I know accurately, up to 2015. I'm not sure how it.
RPDB goes 2 years beyond that. I think. Yeah. But we could definitely compare the two sources. Yeah.
So within this project, are you also doing a subset analysis of patients who may require a BSO for other reasons, for example, prophylactic BSO or prevention of breast ovarian cancer, and how that would affect through the balance of cardiovascular?
Exactly. I have a list of, we decided the best approach would be to try to eliminate as many of those patients as possible from the analysis, because it would be, they would confound some of the relationships later on. We're going to use some ICD codes and procedure codes to try to remove patients who are at higher risk for breast or ovarian cancer, these codes here. So we're planning to exclude these patients from our cohort altogether to try to mitigate that risk of bias. Yeah, that's another possible limitation.
So I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your talk.
Okay.
So you probably have covered this already, but why is it that some surgeons would do an oophorectomy as opposed to just taking the? Are there clinical reasons that would drive you in that direction, and if so, are you able to adjust for it?
So Dr. Gian mentioned the main clinical reason, which if they're taking both normal ones out, it's usually because the person may be at a higher risk for some reason based on family history or personal history of cancer. That would be the reason, probably the most common reason, to remove both at the same time that were otherwise normal. Otherwise, it is possible sometimes that gynecologists would remove one ovary, say if it has a cyst or something that looks suspicious. And that's why we decided to dichotomize our outcome into both being removed versus one or both staying in. Because the most clinically common scenario would be that a surgeon might have to remove one for some other reason, for some sort of, but if they're removing both together, either it was because they had some sort of genetic susceptibility or something like that, or the surgeon is simply just doing it because that's what they think is best for the patient later on to reduce their risk of ovarian cancer. So sort of what we would say an inappropriate oophorectomy. But yes, we don't know 100% based on administrative data what the reason for removing the ovaries.
That's where you're going to see their biggest effect, right? Those are the people without hormones, and yet that's the group in whom they've got cofactors that are going to potentially affect outcomes. Well, the last question I have for you is related to drugs. Like in the over 65, wouldn't you have evidence about hormone replacement therapy?
Yes, and we thought about that. I think even if they're on social assistance or something like that, we may be able to look at a subset. But again, that will be a very highly selected subset. I'm expecting that to be a small population as well. So we will explore that if that could be a way to potentially look at the effects of HRT in
We'll have it in pretty much everyone over 65.
Yeah. Yes, we should have it in everyone over 65, but where I think the biggest impact would be is in women who are premenopausal and getting those hormones. So that will be more limited.
Have you taken into consideration any health policy or health changes in practice that may we alluded to it based on some of the studies?
Yeah. So what in the way I've categorized age at the covariate for age at surgery, I've specifically categorized it based on some of where I would expect practice changes to be based on major publications in the field and things like that. So that was how I've categorized age at surgery to hopefully account for some of those temporal trends. But I think it's something we'll have to look at.
Not sure if this is the right term. Is there kind of a possibility that's sort of a healthy user effect, and that somebody might request this as kind of a proactive protective measure, and then also might look after health better in some other ways? You may see, it could be associated with someone having a healthier lifestyle, which you can't measure. Yeah. Maybe that's going to mitigate some of the deleterious effects.
It's possible.
So, so these things you can't measure in this sense. Is that so? We put a slide on this, given that's quite another question. But what are there ways you can assess how sensitive your results are to unmeasured compounding?
There are. I don't have an extra slide on that for you, but yes, there are definitely some approaches that we could take, external adjustment. I know there are even more complex than that to try to take that into account. So we could look at that.
Especially with the hormone replacement issue, that's probably going to come up whenever you try to publish this. So if you can address that at least in a sensitivity analysis, that could be useful.
Thank you.
So it has to be extremely strongly related to, if you can show us an unrealistically high association to assume to make your effects go away, then that's a stronger finding.
Okay. No, that's great feedback. Yeah.
Just because we're doing all this, can you see who had hysterectomy with self-adjustment?
Yes.
Were you planning on?
Yes, because I was planning on collecting that information as well.
Because that could compound things too.
Yep. We can include that as a covariate for sure.
With your cancer.
Yep.
Right.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, if you're not a